Morning, morning.
Hello, hello. How's everybody doing today?
Good morning.
Good. It's cleaning day.
We will get started a few minutes after the hour. I put a link to the agenda in the Zoom chat window. If everybody could mark your attendance there, and if you have any opens you'd like to discuss, please add them in the open section. A couple businessy things to talk about, and then we're going to have an awesome conversation about OpenVex. Give it one more minute, then we'll jump into the fun. All right. Clock on the wall says 3 after the hour. So I want to welcome everybody to the March 8th edition of the OpenSSF's Vulnerability Disclosure Working Group. I wanted to check if I could ask someone to help us in scribing notes today. Please. Well, as people have time and inclination, thank you, Francis. If you could pitch in and take a note here or there, that'd be super helpful, because there are a lot of people that watch this call either on YouTube or review the notes after the call. As is tradition in our working groups, do we have any new friends that there are first timers today that wanted to introduce themselves and say hello to the group?
Hello to the group.
Hello.
I'm Ole Johansson from Sweden. I've been working a bit with trying to figure out the European Cyber Resilience Act and how that applies to development, and have looked into OpenSSF and looked at a lot of the videos with C-Rob being the superstar. So I'm here to listen in and see what can be done.
Excellent. Well, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you.
Any other new friends?
Yeah, I'll go next. Hey, everybody. I'm Tracy Miranda. I work at ChainGuard. I was recently elected to the OpenSSF governing board. So yeah, just thrilled to get stuck in at that level and also start understanding what all the working groups are doing and what they need. And yeah, just looking forward to learning more about OpenVex as well today.
Excellent. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to say hello?
Oh, you can't hear me. Hello?
Hello. Brandon, if you're talking, we can't hear you.
How about now?
Great.
There we go. I'm Brandon. I'm part of the Google open source security team, involved a lot with the SBOM works, the OpenVex as well, and the Vex community in general, and also the Guac project and other supply chain stuff. So like basically everyone else. So.
Well, welcome. Glad to have you. Any other friends that wanted to introduce themselves? All righty. Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. If anyone has any opens they would like to discuss, please add them in the opens section in the call. Couple business items. If you may or may not be aware, we're currently going through a TAC election. And we would love to get everybody that contributes to the OpenSSF to first off be registered to vote so that you can express your opinion for how we want to lead the foundation. So that's that first link. Anyone that shows up to a working group, you do any commits, you participate in any of the conversations, you update a doc, that type of thing. Is very broad criteria. So please click that voter eligibility self-nomination link. Takes about 30 seconds and you need to have a GitHub ID and then you're done. You're registered to vote. If you are interested in helping lead the foundation, we are doing the election for the TAC. So it's a self-nomination form. You click that link. It's a little bit more than 30 seconds. It's about 2 to 4 minutes of work. You need to have a little bit of a biography and kind of a platform of why you want to help the OpenSSF. But those nominations are currently open. That will wrap up. I believe all the registrations are done on the 12th. And then finally, if you work within the security community, we're looking to have nominations for the security community individual representative. This is typically someone that isn't affiliated with some of our governing board entities, but somebody that is willing to represent the voice of the community and maintainers and the security community at large. So that's another self-nomination item. So please, if you feel you're eligible for that, nominate yourself. And what procedurally, there will be about a week that the voting, we have a voting board that will kind of be managing this. They'll go through, vet all the nominations, and then actually send out links to an electronic voting tool. I believe that's going to be like the week of the 20th. And we should have the elections for both the TAC and the individual representative completed by the end of March. So please express your opinion and participate. Any questions about that? Roger Dodger. In the interest of helping us move forward and be more efficient and focused, I am seeking someone to volunteer from the working group to be our backlog warden. The kind of responsibilities would be helping us keep an eye on issues and pull requests, making sure that they get the attention of the working group, helping us put the agenda together. And if there's something that the group needs to focus in on, they would help draw our attention there. Pretty light work, maybe an hour or so a month. But if anyone is interested in helping donate their time and have an official job, I would be much appreciated in helping us keep ourselves organized and on track. Any questions about that? All right, and our final business item is you may notice in the agenda we have a couple SIG or sub projects going on, like the Autofix SIG. We also have opened up our meetings to the APAC time zone. So we had a call, our second call was last week. We met with representatives from the OSV project. Very excited. They've been longtime participants, but because of the time zone, most of those developers are in Australia. It was challenging for them to get better connection with the group. So we'll be meeting with them on a regular cadence. Very excited about that. Anyone that's interested in participating in that conversation, we always have the Slack channel and mailing lists, but we will physically be getting together at a Zoom call at a time once a month. So if you want to chat with the OSV folks and see how we can collaborate together, I welcome you to join our next call, which should be the last week of March. It should be on the calendar, and I'll actually get it staged in the agenda in a little bit. Any questions about OSV or the APAC call? All right, let us move on to the main course of today's meeting. Let's talk about, continue our conversation about OpenVex. Dan, other Dan, was here about a month ago, gave an overview, highlights of the project and what's going on. And now Dan Lawrence is here today to continue the conversation with us and kind of see if there are areas of partnership and collaboration we can start to work together on this very interesting project. You want to chat a little more, Dan, and I can open it up to questions and answers?
Sure. Yeah, I've got a little presentation. I'm going to walk through kind of a couple motivating examples of just recently on why Vex is important and why we think OpenVex is going to help out. So I'm going to start out. I could do some of this in the terminal, but I screenshotted all of it in case it doesn't work. Let me pull up screen share. So I'll just kind of walk through the presentation first. And if we can probably find more examples on the fly, like this is one representative example that I found like last weekend in a couple minutes. And oh no, my Zoom updated and I'm going to have to restart and come right back in a second. I love the security features of OS X. This happens to me at the worst possible moment. So I will be right back in the call in a minute. I'm sorry about this.
Excellent. No worries, man. No worries at all. It happens to all of us. While we wait for Dan to reboot, do we have any opens or any updates from any of our current active little sub projects people wanted to share with the group?
Hi, I'm currently walking outside, so you'll have to forgive me. I'm also walking by a construction site. There are two documents out there. One is the vulnerability disclosure guide vulnerability disclosure policy for the Open Source Security Foundation that is under review. If we have any time at the end of the day, or at the end of this meeting, I'd love to sit down and like go through the open comments and discuss those if we have time. And then the other guide is the other one is their specification for a automated vulnerability disclosure process that is posted in the side channel and in the email. That's an item that just came, that's coming out of the Autofix SIG. And I want, if people from the vulnerability disclosure working group want to review, I want to open that up to have a look at. So those are the two opens from those groups.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan. And anyone curious about the Auto SIG work and Jonathan's documents, you can take a look in our agenda. And also there is a Slack channel dedicated to the Autofix SIG. And now that Dan's back and successfully rebooted, let us dive back into OpenVex.
All right, OpenVex. I have this fancy themed presentation here. I'm going to be talking about OpenVex. So I'm going to start with why Vex, because that comes up a lot. And I'm going to be walking through this representative example. This is focusing on a container image that we've built. This is one containing Node.js. We try very hard at ChainGuard, our company, to fix or triage or remediate or do something with all of the vulnerabilities that the scanners find in all of the images that we ship. So this example uses Gripe, one of the very popular open source scanning tools on a container, and our Node.js image. So here's what the terminal looks like. We could run this today and probably get something slightly different, but in general, this is what happens. We try to keep our images at 0, which means we triage all of the vulnerabilities and try to patch all of them, which is not an easy feat, but we do a pretty good job of it. And so when something new comes in, we look at it. And this one started appearing just a week or two ago. If you look at the output here, it finds one CVE in our Node.js image in an NPM package called events. The interesting part is that if you scan this image regularly, you'll know it wasn't there a month or so ago, and now it is there, but it's kind of weird that the CVE is from 2018. So how did a CVE from 2018 appear recently? Lots of CVEs appear all the time. Usually they're a little bit more up to date, or they're just invalid and they're sitting around forever. But it's kind of weird for one to go from not there to there when nothing has changed and be that old. It does happen though. So we usually click around and go through the NVD and figure out what's going on, especially for something critical like this one. So it says it's in a package called events. This is probably part of Node.js core because that's all we really install in this image. The next step when triaging something like this is to pull up the CV itself in the database. This is what it looks like if you search for this exact CVE in the NVD. You do not have a lot of information here. This is basically all you have to work with about the CVE itself. It's one paragraph. A vulnerability classified as critical was found in events extension. Then there's a long path, but it kind of ends, the strange part here, if you read this whole thing closely, it ends in a events.php is the actual file. So a little bit skeptical at this point when reading this. It looks like this is some PHP code. It's not unheard of that multiple languages are installed somewhere, and you do have to triage a lot of this. But it says it's SQL injection. So all this seems a little strange. There's a patch there with that commit. And then another vulnerability identifier, but 9.8 critical. That's about as bad as it gets. This is higher than those big OpenSSL CVEs. If you look at the CVS score from a couple months ago, this is about right up there with Heartbleed, about Log4Shell. This is about as bad as it gets. So it's a little weird that it's in PHP when we're looking at Node. The Node.js team does a very good job at security response too. So something seems a little bit off. If you click on that patch, the next thing you find is this. This is the actual GitHub repository that CVE was reported in. Tim Buckingham /bigtree-events. There was a patch that it linked to, again, yeah, from 2018, which is when the CVE, which is the timestamp in that CVE identifier. This gets a little bit semantic now. If you spend much time looking at the NVD, there's some rules about when the identifiers get issued. And the identifier gets issued when a vulnerability was actually first disclosed, not when it was entered into the NVD. So even though somebody filed this one recently, only a couple of weeks ago, which you can see in the timestamp, the identifier still goes back to when it was first disclosed in 2018 in this repository. So it looks like somebody patched a vulnerability here with just a commit. They didn't do much else beyond that. They didn't file for a CVE back then because it was only granted a couple of weeks ago. So someone else filed for a CVE on behalf of this project, bigtree-events. But yes, it is in PHP. This has nothing to do with Node.js. There is no Node.js package involved here. There's nothing in NPM. There's nothing in Node. In fact, looking at this looks like a personal GitHub project. It has 1 star, 1 person is watching it. There's 1 issue open. It hasn't even been touched since 2018 when a couple of these bugs got fixed. It's not for Node. It is for a PHP CMS called Bigtree. So the chances of this actually being present anywhere in the Node.js package or the Node.js image are pretty slim. It just happens to have the same name, events. So then why do scanners find this? Shouldn't scanners do a better job? Isn't this a bug on behalf of the scanners? Well, not really. If you zoom down to the bottom of that NVD entry for this CVE, you see the CPE, which is the schema for how they declare which software packages are affected by this. The schema itself is on Wikipedia. You can read this. That first part here, CPE :2.3:A. I don't ever remember what that part means. Everything has that. But events project, that part is supposed to be the vendor. For a random personal project like this on GitHub, what even is the vendor? There could be a bunch of different things there. For an NPM package, the one that we're actually talking about, the events NPM package, what should be the vendor there either? A lot of this stuff is kind of up to interpretation. And so what the scanners do, which is probably the correct behavior, is that they fail open and they fail safe, which means that if they don't know the actual correct canonical vendor ID for something, then they put a wildcard there basically, because it could be anything. They'd much rather show you extra stuff than miss a really important CV. The same kind of thing comes up all the time with other packages like OpenSSL or Node.js itself, where there isn't a commercial vendor. It's kind of unclear what to put there, whether something's part of a foundation or just a personal GitHub repository. Then there's a bunch of stars because those are typically supposed to be the versions, minor versions, all of that. It looks like this component wasn't ever released. So yeah, stars everywhere. And so when you're a scanner vendor, you parse that Docker image, you see that there's a package called events, and then you query it in the NVD with a bunch of wildcards around everything. And so they have no real way to tell that this doesn't affect that NPM package based on the data we have available here. And so it shows up as a false positive, basically. And this shows up in pretty much any scan results now. For anyone doing anything with Node.js. So one little wildcard here leads to tons and tons and tons of wasted time on behalf of everyone. This is just one example. You can find tons of these, but when you start scanning software and actually looking at the results, the CPE scheme is way too coarsely grained to match accurately. So all the scanners implemented a little bit differently, but for the most part, they fail safe, which means more noise for everyone else to deal with. Here's the actual CPE schema. Yeah, so version, part, vendor, product, version, update, edition, language, software edition, blah, blah, blah. yeah, some CPEs get set a lot more fine grained and have real data in it. But this one, it's about as good as you're going to get for a CV in a random personal project like this one. So this is the main use case. I mean, there's a lot of use cases for Vex, but this is the main one that we deal with personally. When we triage all of these results, there's a lot of borderline ones, right? There are a lot of vulnerabilities that might not actually be exploitable in a certain configuration or might require an attacker to have privileges or all of this stuff. But there's a lot in the system where it's just code in a completely wrong programming language that there's zero chances even in this package and has nothing to do with it just based on noisy matching. So here's kind of that first use case for Vex. Here is what an OpenVex schema looks like. There's some boilerplate at the top explaining what it is. The person that crafted the document, the Vex document. So in this case, we'd be crafting one of these because we just did that triage ourselves. We even did it here as the group, checking each other's work. We could write one together. When we did this, you can change these Vex documents over time. And then here's the important part in the statements. So with an OpenVex document, you couple that vulnerability ID that we just looked at to the products that we looked at it in. And that's a slightly important distinction. So that big tree CMS thing could be a real vulnerability in someone else's product. It's just not a real vulnerability in these specific products that we looked at. And then there's a whole bunch of different status codes. You could say it was fixed, but in this case, here's what it would look like for the CVE. Popped one out in the editor. We have to that CVE-2018-250676 and declare that it is not in the specific image that we looked at it in. In this case, it's a Node.js image, and I think there's a typo there. I should have a colon in between Node and SHA. But you can imagine what this would look like. That specific product is that built final package that we've compiled from all of these different sources. And the justification here is component not present. That's one of the 5 or 6 status fields that you're allowed to use. You get to write a little statement explaining why. Yeah, that vulnerable code is definitely not present. It's a false positive match. Our code is in Node, that code is in PHP, just completely not even related to this. And these come up all the time with different packages. There's a bunch of other examples in our Ruby image and Ruby that you can look up. There are a lot of Ruby gems. There's a core Ruby gem named Logger that's baked into the Ruby distribution. So you can imagine how the wildcards on something named Logger explode combinatorically, because there's probably a package for that in every single programming language and tons of proprietary ones too. So tons of CVs around Logger. None happen to be in the gem that we have inside of our Ruby image because they're all different programming languages. So if we can do that triage, which we are doing and a lot of other organizations are doing, and then put that metadata in a structured format that other people can use, then hopefully we can get scanners to actually ingest these Vex statements as well as the NVD to help provide better results to end users. Real quick aside here, why did a CV just get, this is a lot of other systemic problems, I think, with the vulnerability management ecosystem. Why did a CV just get reported a few weeks ago for a personal project that hasn't been updated in 5 years with 1 star? It's not even clear anyone is using this. To get to that part, a little bit of an aside from Vex, but I think it's worth calling out. If you click on the identifiers in that NVD entry, you get taken to another website called VulDB, VULDB.com. They are what's referred to in the parlance as a CNA. So they are allowed to issue CVEs. A lot of organizations get that status. But this is what you get when you click on their website. It's login required, and it is basically a website for sharing and paying for bounties for exploits against specific CVEs. So if you want to buy one, they're basically telling you might be able to get one for between $0 and $5,000 for this particular CVE. It's kind of this weird incentivized money system. But it still doesn't answer the other question of how it even got found or noticed or entered into this. I'm kind of confused if somebody's paying $5,000 for an exploit for this one. My theory, and I don't know the answer, but if you jump back up to the patch, where was that one up here for the CVE? You notice the commit title. It said added methods for getting a page of upcoming events, fixed SQL injection in searches. My best guess for why these things keep clogging up scan results is that there's some people or group of people out there that are just grepping GitHub for commit messages that say things like fixed SQL injection or switched algorithm in JWTs or something like that, some string match that is a common source of vulnerabilities, and then filing CVE entries against them, basically. So even though someone else has already found and fixed it in random GitHub repositories, people are going around looking for these and then trying to sell exploits in case someone happens to be running an old version of that software. So that whole weird mismatched incentive system coupled with massive amounts of open source data, coupled with very coarsely grained matching in the NVD leads to a lot of noise flowing downstream at people just trying to scan their code and figure out if there are vulnerabilities. Not directly related to Vex, but it does kind of come back to the main theme of the noise isn't going to go away. The incentives in the system are going to keep leading to more and more of these bad vulnerabilities getting filed unless something huge changes. So what's next here for Vex in general? How does OpenVex fit in? To really solve that core use case of stopping that crappy data from flowing downstream to end users, we need a whole bunch of different parties to start implementing and trusting and interchanging and working with these Vex documents. There's also all sorts of weird trust things to worry about when you start talking about that. We did that triage here as a group. Let's say somebody trusted the OpenSSF to be doing that analysis as one example. They might not trust some other random person on the internet. Trusting random people on the internet to add vulnerability data is how we got into this mess in the first place. So that trust model requires some kind of signature, digital signature, attestation framework. So you're not just trusting any Vex document you find sitting around on the ground. You might want to configure that to only trust Vex documents that come from someone else you trust, whether it's the original vendor of that software. I'd probably trust the Node.js authors to do that triage. I trust them anyway implicitly when I'm running Node.js, so I should trust them to say whether or not a vulnerability is exploited. I might trust a third-party vendor. I might hire someone to do that triage on behalf of me and tell me which CVEs I really need to worry about. That's kind of a personal choice. So the Vex documents, the Vex schema, the Vex working groups kind of handle that interchange format, but they don't really solve the whole end-to-end use case around how do scanners know which Vex documents to trust on behalf of you. So that's kind of where some of the extra stuff in OpenVex comes in. It's designed to fit into a lot of the other signing and attestation formats that are used throughout the open source ecosystem, like in Toto and SIG stores. So we can start to work with scanners and figure out how they can be configured on behalf of companies and issue these on behalf of companies and signing them. Vex as a whole is very new. The people that we deal with tend to use Sneak, Gripe, Trivy, Twistlock, a bunch of these common ones, but there's hundreds and hundreds of other scanners out there. In the audit we've done, and we could be missing things because there's so many, none of them really seem to support any Vex frameworks today, even though there are a few other formats for this. The main ones, the main elephants in the room that have been doing Vex before this are CSAF. It's a very large schema that does Vex and a whole bunch of other things as well for security reporting and data interchange and all of that. There aren't great libraries for it. It's just a massive specification in general. So if we're trying to get scanners to add something new, something simple and focused to the Vex case, seems to be a little bit easier. Also, just personally, we like standards that do one thing well, rather than kind of large overall envelope formats. CycloneDX also has a Vex profile, but CycloneDX is a full SBOM format. You can issue Vex documents in it without the whole SBOM stuff. But it's kind of off-putting a whole different tool set to people that are using some of the other SBOM formats, like things like SPDX. I did this whole Vex demo without even mentioning SBOM and talking about it because you don't need to. It's related to SBOM, and SBOM is going to kind of blow up that noise problem, but you don't need SBOMs for Vex to be useful. So something decoupled from any of the major SBOM formats seems to have a better chance of getting widespread adoption, in our opinion. And then finally, this as a whole is incredibly new. I think if we start fresh, start with the very minimum fields that we need, it'll, of course, like every specification, get complicated over time. But why start there if we don't need to? There's a lot of talk about fragmentation. Again, that argument doesn't really resonate with me personally. There's not much of anything to fragment. We haven't been able to find any Vex documents out there yet, just the working group. There's of course going to be multiple formats. SPDX also has a Vex profile going on inside of that format. The CISA working group kind of published this lowest common denominator definition of what Vex actually is and what it means to be Vex semantically. So any format that does that, in my coworker Adolfo just did some demos last week. Anybody that actually has that metadata in different formats should be able to interchange just fine. They semantically explain, here's what a product is, here's what a vulnerability identifier is, and the formats can choose to represent it in different ways, whether it's XML, please no, but something like that, or even custom schemas. There's going to be a bunch of different ways of representing those same 4 or 5 key fields, whether you embed it somewhere else or not. But as long as you do that, as long as you are philosophically Vex as defined by the US government CISA working group, then it'll all be interoperable anyway. So it's pretty straightforward.
Hey, Dan.
We have a
sorry to
question,
interrupt.
Dan.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want the questions at the end or in between,
Sure, now works.
Jonathan?
All right, I was just switching computers. Can you hear me?
Yes, you got out of the car. Nice. Last I saw you, you were
Yeah, I
driving.
did. Now back on my desk. Yeah, I just, it's dental appointment overlap. Anywho, so, one of the things that I have seen that a lot of these dependency scanners try to handle well, right, is the like flagging the this is vulnerable. One of the things that I've not seen a lot of products try to solve is the this project is, or this dependency is vendored in some other project, and add the CPEs for the, or whatever, like the pearls, the CPEs, you know, for the vendor down, the project downstream that vendors that project and is thus still vulnerable to that upstream CVE, and try to capture that information as well. Like, you know, like you see a lot of the errata in the CVE listings, like from like links to Red Hat's disclosure pages and the ADA in the, you know, Apache Software Foundation's disclosures, but those don't end up getting attached usually in these larger you know, scanner tools. So is this also a goal to solve here, or is that a non-goal?
I know Brandon introduced himself at the start of this call. Brandon just published an awesome blog post on literally yesterday, on ways to do like partial recombination of VEX documents as software gets vendored. I don't want to call on you on the spot, Brandon, but I think what Jonathan just described is what your blog post yesterday was about. Is that correct? Maybe.
I think he disconnected a few minutes ago. He had to switch to another meeting.
I think it was on the OSV blog. If somebody wants to look it up and grab the link, I know Parko's here, he read it. If somebody wants to drop the link in here, but I think that's correct. What was that, Tracy?
I said I dropped the link in.
Oh, awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, take a look at that, Jonathan. Let me know if that answers your question, but in general, that is a very broad topic and you're completely correct. One common example there is Node.js vendors its own version of OpenSSL inside of it. They have a bunch of good reasons for doing that, but it means that scanners don't know about that version of OpenSSL. And unless they're very, very smart, and some of them might know that, but most of the common scanners, last I checked, when that last round of OpenSSL vulnerabilities came out a few months back, did not know that Node.js had its own version of OpenSSL inside of that. And so if you had a safe version of OpenSSL installed on a system, and then you had a version of Node.js installed on that system with the dangerous version of OpenSSL, the scanners wouldn't pick that up. They just see that system-wide one.
Yeah. Also in that case, when they announced, like they did issue an advisory saying Node.js 17 and 18 contain OpenSSL in their vulnerable version, but they didn't say Node 16 also contained the same OpenSSL because it was end of life. So, and they said we don't support end of life, so they didn't mention it. So I reached out to them and then they added it. But yeah, unless you know, then you don't know.
Yeah, I don't know that VEX will solve that problem completely from the start. I think you need a lot better data as well. I think the OSV project and the Guac project and some of these others are doing a great job representing that full graph. Ideally, an end user would have enough data to just know that Node has this version of OpenSSL and therefore also query for all OpenSSL vulnerabilities instead of just the Node ones. But again, that'll lead to a whole bunch of noise that you need a way to quiet. I think Art looks like he's here. I still remember this talk Art gave at the first supply chain security con called the supply chain of vulnerabilities itself. And I think I might be completely misrepresenting it. I think he said only around 4% of vulnerabilities are exploited or exploitable in software that packages that. So each time you go down that chain, you're losing a big chunk. Is that somewhat correct, Art? Did I cite you correctly there?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think I think I was citing Chris Weissopel of Veracode, but just important nuance. You know, that figure was for the software that they were looking at. So I don't deny that number, but I think it might vary depending on the ecosystem you're working in. But I think the takeaway is you should not assume downstream inheritance of vulnerability or non-vulnerability. You kind of got to look most of the time, which is horrible, but I think that's where things are. Over, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so if you only solve that first half of the problem of clearly stating which software is bundled, then you're just going to blow up the noise problem unless you also solve a way to carry on transmit that exploitability information to alongside of that. So I think Brandon's blog post from yesterday addresses it pretty well. Any other questions on that one? All right, one final point, everyone's favorite topic. We do hope eventually to propose OpenVex as an international standard. And it turns out that doing that is tricky legally, and it's important to get a lot of this stuff right from the beginning. You probably saw this in the SALSA specification working group in the OpenSSF. A lot of other standards go through this. I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that standards and specifications are treated much, much differently from a licensing and patent perspective than just code. And the great folks at the OpenSSF and the Linux Foundation put together this process called the community specification process, where if you follow that, then you get a lot more protections than just throwing like a Creative Commons or Apache MIT license in a repository and calling something a specification. And if you don't do that from the start, it becomes very hard to propose these things as international standards. Jory and the specification group at the Linux Foundation explained this so many times, and I don't quite understand it because I'm not a lawyer, but I trust them. And so we set up OpenVex from the start with this process to make sure we are protected in that event of proposing it to an international standards group. So if we do all of this correctly, then I do hope we can get some ISO specification, i.e. TF-RFC, something like that. I don't know that we have any plans of exactly which direction to go, but for VEX itself to reach that goal of scanner, distributor, consumer, widespread adoption, it's important to get this into an international standards group. Roadmap, make the spec. We've got a first version. That first version was made by literally just taking the exact requirements from the SISA document, putting them into a JSON field with nothing else, the bare minimum viable specification according to VEX, and starting that way. Now we're kind of at that stage of working with projects to produce VEX documents. As software producers ourselves, we're able to do that for our software just to try it out, see what's missing, see what extra features we need. And as open source maintainers, we can work with those projects too, because open source projects get bugged constantly about these noisy CVEs. And giving them a tool to quiet that or stop people from bothering them resonates a lot with a lot of different maintainers. Get it working end to end. So we've got to work with a few scanners. We're hoping to work with the Gripe folks to start out with to implement that spec and then flesh out the other parts beyond the spec, the stuff I talked about before. How do I trust this VEX document? How do I configure which VEX sources I trust for which pieces of software? There's a lot of different status codes in there. That one around that code just is not even present is the simplest. There's a lot of other more nuanced ones around. It's not exploitable in the default configuration, but might be in other configurations. So you as an end user, based on your risk tolerance, might want to trust only stuff for the reasons of the code not being there, but you might still want to take another look yourself for other statuses. So there's a lot of UX here to figure out to really quiet the noise problem while still keeping transparency throughout the entire supply chain. If that goes well, just rinse and repeat and see if we get more widespread adoption. And then, of course, Tracy threw this one in here, one of my favorite memes about VEX. I did this during the World Cup. But yeah, as SBOMs add transparency, we need tools to combat the noise that comes with transparency. Getting rid of SBOMs to solve the noise problem is one approach, but it also loses out on a bunch of the benefits of SBOMs. So SBOMs and VEX together, we can improve transparency, security, and the noise problem at the same time is our hope here. Any other questions?
Yes.
Everyone is now a VEXpert.
Expert. No, I've seen a lot of noise on the interwebs about VRFs and VEX.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on those two?
VRFs. What is that again? I think, is that the right acronym or is there something slightly different? VEX versus, I know there's another one you're talking about, but is it VRF?
Yeah, I think it comes
VDF,
from...
right?
Oh, right. VDF. Sorry. Yep.
VDF.
VDF.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe there is a VRF too. There's a lot of acronyms.
Yeah, there's no shortage of them.
VDR, right? Is that it?
VDR. Yeah.
VDR. Yeah. VDR. I think. Yeah, my take. VDR is vulnerability disclosure report. I think is that what it's called? Parko, am I getting this right? Now I'm blanking on what it's actually called. I as long as it's correct, then I know my take. Yeah, vulnerability disclosure report. That is kind of, I look at it as almost the opposite of VEX in some ways. A VDR document, my understanding anyway, is supposed to contain a list of the vulnerabilities that are exploitable in a piece of software. That's useful, but it's like a summary of all of that information. The flip side is where VEX says this vulnerability is not exploitable. So there are kind of two paths to get to that same goal. The big nuance, in my opinion, is that there's not always an answer of is it exploitable or is it not, especially for late breaking new vulnerabilities. There's a third intermediate state there, which is we don't know yet or we haven't looked yet or something like that. And so if you're using that VDR style model of, I assume my vendors will tell me if something is exploitable and I have this API to hit and I'll check. The morning log for shell happens or the next log for shell happens and you hit all these APIs and it doesn't show up in that report. You're left wondering, did they do that triage and affirmatively state that it's not there because it's not in this document, or have they just not done that triage yet? Where with VEX, you know that if it's not there saying it's not exploitable, then you get to assume that it is exploitable until you're told otherwise. So that slight default switches it from kind of like a fail open to fail closed model, I guess in my opinion, which lets you decide what to do in those situations.
So will we see an open VDR coming?
I'm not sure, maybe. So.
Yeah, I added a link in the chat here for some sort of comparison.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's my high level. I think there's a couple memes or two somewhere. But yeah, I think coupled with SBOMs, I mean, to some extent, I think the VDR concept is great. Like if you can trust your vendors to tell you that information, it saves you a lot of time, but it requires you to be able to trust your vendors. And in my opinion, one of the main goals of SBOMs is to give you transparency in that code so you don't have to just blindly trust your vendors. You can see what's in there and do a lot of that querying yourself. So VEX plus SBOMs is kind of solves that same use case as VDR in the end. Which if you want that transparency, if you want to be able to feel safer, having the SBOM data, doing the queries yourself, and then checking for VEX entries. It is more work, to be clear, than just asking a vendor whether or not there's anything you need to worry about. But hopefully you get a lot more benefit out of the transparency and extra knowledge in that process.
I think that's my take. I mean, in VEX, you can say that you're affected, another comment, please update or something.
Right.
So yeah, I'm confused, but on a higher level. Thank you for the answer.
Art.
Yeah, sorry, just one day a couple months ago, the acronym VDR surprised the heck out of me and I went to dig it up. It's not crystal clear to me that VDR is well specified anywhere. I think NIST put it up in an SP, and the CycloneDX folks, have perfectly fine, chosen that they're going to implement it or just talk about it more. But one, analog to VEX, right? Even there's no such thing as OpenVDR currently that has an actual schema or format or anything. So my opinion is that VDR is pretty weakly specified and not to get too fired up about it at this point. No one is actually requiring them or has a special format you have to do them in just yet. That I know of at least. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Art. So caveat all of my statements there with there might be a bunch of different VDRs weakly specified, and my definition of them might be completely wrong based on something different from someone else's.
Yeah, not saying yours is wrong,
Yeah.
just that it's not. There's no answer, I don't think yet.
Right.
That's all. Yep.
So as we open this up to the floor for questions, I want to thank Dan for putting this little presentation together. Very helpful, very interesting problem. So first off, group, what additional questions or comments do we have about OpenVEX? Don't everybody talk at once. Jeffrey.
I know that you've done some outreach to some of the standards groups that have been working on this. What is the philosophy in terms of, trying to collaborate with other standards groups that have been participating versus trying to sort of advance this? Is it a little early in the game yet, or any other thoughts you have on that? Because obviously in the past, standards have driven a lot of this. Currently, the pendulum swung to the point where code drives a lot of this. But does this risk getting the industry even a bit more confused by pushing this aggressively at this stage, right? Because one of the things that we put out as a position on this is that clients, customers, developers, the industry at large is just getting overwhelmed with every, a new shiny object showing up in the toy box every, 4 weeks. And I'm saying that, and I'm not trying to throw any shade on the OpenVex project per se, but I'm just wondering if this is something that adds yet another thing on the OpenSSF agenda that when we aren't quite fully executing on other things, and or maybe it's early enough, we should still be trying to work in some of these other standards organizations to influence them and get everyone more on the same page before we sort of try and dramatically plant a flag. So I'm certainly asking that question in an open-minded way and love to hear your thoughts.
Which standard organizations do you mean, like ISO, IETF, that kind of thing?
Yeah, the ones that you just kind of ticked off, but certainly the folks that have been working around SBOM have, they even presented on VEX a bit at the conference in Europe towards the end of last year. So
I'm not was that the presentation from Justin Murphy? Is that the one you're talking about at OSSCon Dublin?
That one, and then there was another one by the fellow that from the government organization whose name I should have on the
I think that's Justin Murphy, or Alan Friedman. Are you talking about
Friedman,
them?
sure,
Yes.
I was thinking.
Alan and Justin are great. They were part of the CISA working group that formalized this definition of VEX. I don't see either of them here in the call, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, and I know Art was in that as well. But my understanding is that the goal of that working group was to define what VEX is, not to define a particular format. Now that we have this broader definition of VEX, there's room for formats like this one to meet that definition. And yes, we would like this to be proposed as an international standard, either through ISO or IETF. We can get that process started whenever there's comfort, I guess, that this works. The IETF's motto, I guess, philosophically is what aligns with me, of working code and rough consensus. So showing some amount of working code end to end, I think we'd like to do first, showing this flowing all the way from a software distributor through a scanner down to a customer. When we've proven that works all the way, then I think I'd be happy to push this through a standardization process. Did I say any of that correctly, Art?
Yeah, no, I was going to just quickly back that up. The CISA doc, which should be published any day now, waiting for a legal review, I think, is sort of a requirements level, minimum requirements. It is supposedly carefully abstracted away from an actual implementation. There can be many implementations. You can call the fields what you want. You can get into details about how you want to do things, as long as in theory you meet, you've got these informational elements and they relate in a reasonable way. We tried very hard to sort of meet this weird middle ground of, there's a couple implementations already out there. OpenVex came along at a great time in that process to show another implementation, a much cleaner, simpler, smaller one. And yeah, the CISA work is intended to be a requirements level, high level requirements level, minimum requirements level, a layer away at least from implementation. So right on, Dan. Yeah.
Thanks. Did that answer your question, Jeffrey? Anything else there?
Yeah, I understand. It's logical, but it still doesn't sort of help the problem of customers are all struggling with, what do I do about my basic SBOM, much less VEX, and oh my God, I'm just going to run in the opposite direction because I can't keep up with the volume of churn that seems to be happening out in these communities.
Yeah, I really see this as something end users shouldn't even have to know about if we do it correctly. I think it's a concern for software distributors to deal with and a concern for scanner vendors to deal with. But those same software distributors, we've heard in all of the SBOM working groups that one of their main fears of SBOM is that added transparency will lead to their customers blowing up their phone lines of all of the noise from the scanners. And so VEX is solving a real pain point for them. So I think that there is going to be motivation to do something there. You have to do SBOMs, and those support calls and emails and all of that really are going to, I completely buy into that argument, and they really are going to lead to a lot of cost and noise and confusion for those end users. So something has to be done here. I hope the end users don't have to know about it, though. I hope their scanners just automatically quiet stuff in ways that give them the information they need. That's my motivation.
I can't be the only one in this crowd with a question or a comment.
Group, what additional feedback or questions do we have?
In regards to the IETF, there's a SCIT working group. I don't know if you've been there, Dan, but they're working a lot with related issues, and maybe that's a way to start the discussion.
Yeah, my understanding of that group, they're working on ledgers and technologies for kind of distributing information like this. I follow the list. They like repositories for storing and interchanging SBOMs and VEX documents and all of that. That kind of sits in that section, I guess, below now we have the documents. How do we get them around to people? How do they find them? How do they know which ones they can trust? I think that it would align that way pretty well. I know that I don't know much about those standards groups at all. I know SPDX is an ISO standard that seems to have worked well. I don't know why anyone, like, to be honest, I just don't know why you'd pick one over the other. So I don't have an opinion there.
Probably a different discussion.
Yeah.
There are some differences, and they both have pluses and minuses, but man, it's a whole different world. Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot of hot takes on that one.
I see Jay has a question.
Not a question, just more like a comment. I think first of all, great presentation. I had a chance to see Adolfo do it at the CISA VEX working group meeting on Monday, and he had a different spin, and it was actually a live demo and all that kind of stuff, which was really cool too. So third time going through something like this, a lot of great stuff going on. If the desire is towards ISO specification, I guess there's no better place to begin than right here, because OpenSSF, and what you're describing is the past submitter process, and working on it here in the OpenSSF, and of course going through Jory over there in the JDF. There's actually a step-by-step process that they're actually currently. It's not written down on paper yet, but it is currently being written down on paper. But part of that process is collaboration and contribution here, and working on it here, doing that, and then adoption and everything else is a whole explanatory report process. I'm not going to do all that here, but saying this is a great place to start. And I know a few of us feel the same way. So I mean, if that's the discussion that we're heading in, let's head into it.
Awesome. Yeah, that's exactly what we'd like to do. And Jory, jumped in the first day and told us exactly what we had to do for community specification. So we should be set up there. The JDF stuff. I think Tracy just dropped some notes in. So yeah, that's what we'd like to do.
And that would be my next question is, what would you like for us to assist with? What feedback can we give you? How can we, what were you seeking and kind of talking with us about this? How can this working group?
Sure. Yeah, I think we're only 5 minutes left, so we probably won't get through the whole thing. But yeah, we'd like to move the OpenVex project to part of this working group. And I know we were just in a TAC call yesterday going through details of exactly how that happens in general in the OpenSSF CRO. But yeah, we'd like to follow that process and be adopted by this working group, and then eventually go through the full JDF stuff and become a real international standard. So whatever other stuff people would like to see, whatever, yeah, I guess to get that process started.
All right. And what we'll do is we will start that process off with a issue in our repository and a note out to our working group. soliciting our collaborators and contributors to vote on, do they think this is something that aligns with our working group goals and mission? And as we get that feedback, we will take the steps following the exciting new process that has some better documentation, I heard late yesterday. But we can follow that through if the group feels that there is merit in this collaboration.
Hey, Dan, what kind of timeline did you have in mind here? Like weeks, months, years for adoption?
For adoption by the working group or adoption by the industry?
The working group first, and then let's see about the industry. That will give us an idea of how urgent you have.
Whenever, we're not waiting on anything, but we're not in a huge rush either. So whatever the working group feels.
And we'll also, I'll collect some links to your GitHub repo for your project. If anyone's interested in directly engaging right now, I'm sure patches are always welcome.
Yes.
Right. So any additional questions, feedback, comments? All right. Well, I want to thank the Dans for coming and sharing this with us. I think it's a very interesting idea. I think it's something that could be very useful to the ecosystem. And I'll get that issue set up and sent out to everybody to express your opinion on, to see if this is something we want to formally adopt and start official collaboration on. And thank you again for your time and your dedication to this, helping make the world a little bit better.
Awesome. Thank you all.
All right. Cheers all.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks,
Yes.
everyone. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Wow.